everyone, I'm back to go over our first script for our 3D puzzle game in Godot. So you may have already, with one of the puzzle scenes open and the root or parent node active, clicked on the new script button to create a new script in our script's location with a more descriptive name. I'm using move and set. Now, my script is an empty script by default. All it's doing is extending the animatable body 3D, which we know is the class that gives us access to the different properties and methods and functions that animatable bodies can use. So I am going to just copy over into the script. So you can see there is some information about the class. And next we're having some global variables. So global variables are changeable data, and when they're global, it just means that they're accessible by the entire script. So for that to happen, we just want to make sure that they're at the top. Now, our first global variable is to create a variable that represents the pieces group that we have created previously and connected to all of our puzzle piece nodes. So at onReady just makes sure that any required data for the variable is in place before the value is determined. So it usually runs, I believe, right before the ready function. So at onReady just means that it's going to make sure everything's in place before the variable should run. The variable's name is in group. This could be anything, but usually you want something that's going to be descriptive. And this particular variable is returning an array. So a list of everything that is in our pieces group. It's using two default functions, getTree to access the SceneTree, period getNodes in group to find all of the nodes in the particular group, and then you just want to make sure that this matches the name of the group that you used. Now, the second variable that we have has @export in front of it, and that part's probably optional in this case, but what @export does is makes the variable active over in the inspector. So when you're trying out things in the game, you can toggle it on and off at any time, or if it was a different type of data, you would be able to like set the speed of something or whatever it happens to be. Now, the type is set to bool, which means it's true or false, and setting the type just makes it easier to troubleshoot if there's a problem later on. So you don't necessarily have to do it, but it's a good practice, so I prefer to do it. And it is set to false. So this variable is going to represent, is our piece actively selected and should be able to move or not? At the start, nothing is active, so this needs to be false. Now, the next step is going to be creating a input map to work with. So I'm going to come back to the script a little bit later. So I'm just going to come over to the project menu, project settings, and input map. And be careful, it's really easy to accidentally use filter by name. We want to add new actions, and we're going to add a bunch of different actions. I'm going to add move left, move right. Now right now these are just names, they're not actually going to do anything, but we just want them to be descriptive of whatever the actions are going to be. And so I am going to add move closer, move away, restart, place for when I'm placing the puzzle pieces in the frame, rotating clockwise, and I'm just using CC to represent counterclockwise. And then my last action is going to be for selecting a piece. Notice there's an underscore instead of a space wherever I might have a space. All right, so this just creates a bunch of empty actions. All they are right now are names. So I'm going to click on the plus next to each action to determine what input I want. Now for moving left, I probably want the A key. I'm going to do plus again and add the left arrow key. I'm going to do the same for move right. So D and the right arrow. Move closer, it's going to be S and the down arrow. Move away is going to be W and the up arrow. Restart is going to be R. Place is going to be space. Rotate clockwise is going to be E. Counterclockwise is going to be Q. And for select piece, I'm going to go inside the mouse button area and choose the left mouse button. And now my input map is all set, so I can close out. All right, so I have a bunch of input names that are set up and connected to specific keys. Right now, that's all they are. They're not going to do anything. So I need to add some things to my move and set script so that this actually works. So first thing I'm going to do is, first of all, make sure that my animatable body 3D node is selected over here. And I'm going to come over to the node tab. We've worked with groups previously. I'm going to switch back over to signals. And there are a bunch of signals, and a signal is just a way to communicate. You can think of it like just a notification that something is happening. There's some signals or some notifications that we can automatically create and connect to different actions. And sometimes we might do it completely manually. But it's just a way to let the game know that something is happening, and then we can take that information and trigger something else as a result. So in this case, I want an input event, and I'm just going to double click, make sure that the node with the script is selected, and click on connect. And so you'll notice there's this little green indicator when this is connected, and I'm actually going to need to connect this from all of my different puzzle pieces later on in the future. So for now, it's just connected to my short U piece. I'm going to need to do that one step to connect from all of them. And I'll also be adding the script to all of the others at some point as well. All right, I'm going to replace the information of the function. So first of all, just a little information about the function itself. And then I'm going to start replacing, or actually before I start replacing, you'll notice we have a bunch of parameters that are passed to the function that are there by default. I know I'm not going to be using the camera, so I'm just adding an underscore so I don't get any warnings. I'm not using event position. I'm not using normal. I'm not using shape index. The only parameter I'm actually using is event, so when there's the input event from the mouse clicking or whatever happens to be going on. All right, so that's been corrected. Pass is just here as a placeholder. If we don't have anything, it'll have an error and be like, hey, there's a problem, there should be something in the function. So when we want to just temporarily have something empty, we just leave the word pass. All right, so now I'm going to start actually working on the input. And I'm just going to copy over what I already have set up and then just talk to you a little bit about it. All right. So you may have already noticed there are a lot of comments that are in this script just to give you all some helpful information about what is actually going on. If I was coding this for myself, I wouldn't use anywhere near as many comments. This is just to be informative. But it is a good practice to use descriptive comments periodically so that it's clear what's going on in your code. This is helpful when you're working with a team. It's also helpful when you want a reminder of how you did something, and if you just come back and it's just the straight code without any comments, it can be harder to figure out what you did and why you did certain things. So the comments can be really helpful. All right, so we have this default function created by connecting the input event. If the event is pressing an action called select piece. If you named yours something different, you want to make sure that that name matches. So if this key is pressed for select piece, do whatever follows. Now, first thing is going to be making sure that all of the pieces in the group are not actually active when the input is pressed. So it's making everything inactive first so that we're not accidentally activating things that shouldn't be active. So it's using a for loop to do that. So for each in group, we've already created a variable called in group up here. So that's the information. It's just using the array, the list of the nodes in the group, and each just represents each node. So this could be called anything, it just represents the different nodes. And so we're just setting every node inside of the group to make sure that the isActive variable for each one is set to false. So that's it for the for loop. Now, next up, later on when we're actually putting the puzzle pieces into the same scene, we're going to be setting all of them to a position of 2.7 on the y-axis. And when they're placed, they'll be moving down to 0 on the y-axis. So if the y position is 2.7, then we want to make sure that the self, the active node, is set to true so that it recognizes it in our code that this is active. Again, isActive is just a variable we've created that we can set between true and false, and depending on if it's true or if it's false, we can use that information in other parts of our script later on. Now, I skipped over this, but I created a variable for the rounded value for the y position. And all this is doing is it's taking the y position, and if it's a float value, which it likely is, I'm just making sure that it's returning 1 decimal point. So multiplying the y position by 10 and then rounding that number, dividing that again by 10, just makes sure that it's actually 1 decimal point. So it's not going to have any precision issues later on. So when I'm in an if statement, when I want to say something is equal, I actually need 2 equals in a row. So if that rounded y position equals 2.7, then that node is active, and so I'm setting that variable to true. Else, so otherwise, just return. And return means the function is ending here, nothing else is going to be happening. All right, so that is my first function. The next thing I think I want to do at this point is actually create a second script to work with, and then I'll come back into the script when I've done a little additional setup there. So I'm just going to click over in the SceneTree so that it's active. Doesn't really matter which node is active because the script isn't actually going to be connected to any of them. I'm going to be creating a global script that all of my other scripts can use no matter what pieces it is in the game. So plus script, and I want to make sure I'm choosing my script folder. So I'm going to open that, and I'm just going to make sure that the name is set to global. And I could have also done that over on this side, changing it here. But I want the script directory, and I want the name to be global because this is going to be a global script. You'll also see it called Autoload in some cases. Should have set that to empty first, but it doesn't matter. I'm just going to delete everything that's here because I'm going to be using the script in a different way that I've been using the first one. So that's all just empty, Command S to save. And now I'm going to set the script so that it's actually global. So in the project menu, back in project settings, we have this globals tab. I just need to find my global script so that I can open it and then add it as a global script. So whenever I use the name global, it will access what's inside of the script so that I can use it where I need it. And what I'm going to be doing in this script is creating my own signals, and I'm going to have 3 of them. So my first signal, so this is just extending node, which is just super generic so that it will work for any script. But the important part is having signals, and I'm going to have one for when each piece is placed, I'm going to have a signal for when the level is won, and I'm going to have a signal for when the level is lost. So you can create signals in individual scripts that are connected to objects, and then they work specifically for that object. When we create the signal in the Autoload or in the global script, what it does is it allows us to access them from everywhere. So it's sort of the difference between speaking in a room to everyone that's there, and then using the intercom so that you can talk to everyone in the building. So that's sort of the difference between a local script in one script and the global one that anyone can access. So just 3 signals: when the piece is placed, when the level's won, and when the level's lost. And I'm just going to save that. Now, one thing that I want to mention that can take a little bit of getting used to is we have just an easy way to toggle back and forth between any scripts or documentation that's active as we go over here. And so this really has nothing to do with the current scene that's open, the current node that's active. You can change back and forth between this no matter what you're on. It's not really a big deal. But sometimes you might switch to a specific scene because you think it's connected to the script, and it's not the case at all. You can just access them from over here. And if a script that you're working on doesn't show for some reason, you can always just expand your script directory, double click on it, and then you should be able to access from there. All right, so I have my script all set up for the Autoload or global, and now I'm going to be coming back to complete my move and set script. So I'm going to have a second function, and this one is going to be for controlling all the rest of my input. And I'm just going to copy and paste from my other script. I want this one to be starting from all the way over on the left, no tabbing for the new function. Now, this is a default function that's available to inside of GDScript. So this is just a function that represents some sort of input event is happening. And so I'm going to have a variable at the start, and this is local because it's only available inside this particular function, but it's available to the entire function, which is why it's at the top over here. And the type is set to vector3 because it's going to be representing the vector3 coordinates for the direction the puzzle piece is moving. And so it's just setting all of those vector3 coordinates to 0 at the very start. And now I have a series of if statements to control: if this input happens, do this. If this happens, do that. Or don't do that, depending on what it may be. So the first if event represents when we want to restart the game. So if there's an event that is action pressed, so is pressing on the key with the name restart, then do this. So in this case, we're accessing the scene tree and then reloading the current scene. And those are just default methods that are available. Now, next up, I just want to make sure that if the game piece isn't active, it's not going to do anything that follows because everything else has to do with the actual movement. So if not, our variable is active, which means it's the same thing as saying if is active equals false, then return and don't do anything. So don't do the rest of the script. If the event is the action pressed for our placing action, we're going to change the move direction with some vector3 numbers. So set to 0, -5, and then 0. So that's just on the y-axis, setting it to -5. Now, the game pieces are going to be set to 2.7 at the start, and they'll end up at 0 if they end up inside the puzzle frame at the right place. And so we're just setting the direction to move -5, so it's actually going below 0. So if they're not placed in the frame, we have an easy indicator that they missed entirely. So that move direction is set to the vector3 coordinates that we want. I'm setting the current node to not be active, so we're setting is active to false. And then I'm going to emit the piece placed signal. So global to access that global autoload script. Then I need the name of the signal followed by .emit. Looks like I missed something. I'll add that in a little bit. All right, next up is an if statement to control moving clockwise or counterclockwise. So if the event is the rotate clockwise action, these represent or. The event is the rotate counterclockwise, and so if it's either clockwise or if it's counterclockwise, then you're going to do this. So this variable represents the direction that you're rotating, and we're going to be setting it as an integer, so it's not a float. So putting integer with some parentheses just means that anything inside of the parenthesis is going to be turned into an integer, even if it is a float. Now, input.getAxis is going to be taking the two actions that I have set here. Oh, and I think I named mine a little bit differently over here, so I just want to make sure I'm definitely using the same names. So I have rotate clockwise, rotate counterclockwise, and so getAxis is setting the first action to -1.0 and the second action to 1.0. So again, float numbers that get converted to integers, so a positive or negative number. Now, rotation degrees is a default property, and so I'm looking just at the rotation of the y value, and I'm going to just keep adding to that value and adding the rotate direction times 90. So multiplying by positive or -1 means that I'm either adding or subtracting 90 to the current rotation. And so this will allow me to keep rotating clockwise or counterclockwise. And I just want to mention plus equals, if you're not aware, is saying add this and then return the result. So if I was just saying plus, it would just be adding the numbers without actually doing anything with it. So this actually adds and changes the rotation degrees for the y-axis. All right, next up is actually the movement. And so, oh, and I think this is something I'm not keeping, so I'm just going to delete that. So we have the movement direction .x, so specifically the x-axis, and that's going to equal the input, and I'm using getAxis again for the left and for the right. So it's setting the left input to a -1, the right input to a +1. Same thing for the z-axis, so move away and move closer. -1, +1. And then I'm going to use move and collide. Move and collide is a default method that's available to animatable bodies, and it needs some sort of parameter to tell it what's actually moving and colliding, so we're using move direction. So this actually takes move direction and moves the piece based on it, and then if the piece runs into anything else and there's a collision, it stops the movement. Now, there is one last piece to this that I want to add, and this is just going to be correcting the position after it's been moved and collided. So just making sure that the numbers end up being rounded. So often when you have a collision and your object stops, it might actually bounce slightly back before stopping, and you often end up with float numbers for the position after the collision, and that just makes our movement a lot less precise, and over time it sort of gets everything sort of offset, and then it makes it a lot harder to fit our puzzle pieces back together again. So there are a few ways that I could do this, but I just want to make sure that it has, after moving collide, that that position is actually rounded so that it's back to being an integer instead of being a float number, to keep that movement really precise. So this is setting the global position for the x-axis to just the rounded global position for the x-axis. And same thing for z. The global position, which is a default property of the node, is going to be the rounded global position for the z-axis. And sometimes it's helpful to just check where things are, and so you can always add a print statement when you're troubleshooting to see what's actually happening. And so that part's optional. If things aren't going where you expect them to, or you're having issues with things fitting together properly, just adding that in to check things out can be pretty helpful. All right, and I'm just going to save with Command S. I realized that I have my global script actually connected to my collision shape, and I don't want this connected to anything. So I'm just going to come over and detach the script. So that was just right-clicking, and you can either attach or detach a script using that method. All right, so now I'm just going to go through and connect the script to the other moving puzzle pieces. So I'm just going to open them up by double-clicking from the file system, and I can just drag from the file system over the parent node for both of my scripts. All right, now I have a couple other things that I need to do here. I want to make sure, yep, looks like the groups are all set there, but I need to make sure that the function for the onInput event is actually connected to all of the different pieces. You'll notice this one actually has a signal indicator, and so I need to make sure that the other ones end up with the same thing. So I need to make sure my root node is selected. Under signals, I'm just going to double click and connect. It doesn't create a new input because it recognizes that there's one there automatically. You can see the indicator has changed. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. My root is active, double clicking on input event, making sure that it's connected. And now that has updated as well. So now all three of my pieces are going to be using the script, and they're going to be using all of the actions. So from here I can just save. One thing I do want to mention though, when you save, it's just the active scene. So I either want to come over to the different tabs, and there's also an option to save all of the scenes, kind of a crazy shortcut there, which is why I don't really remember it. All right, I will be back with another video for some other functionality that we'll be adding to the game.